Hello chess friends, and welcome to Azadov's chess channel, and welcome to my chess game series. So in this series I'm showing you, well, one of my games in which I think I played very correctly, because you see, in this series I'm publishing only the games in which I didn't have mistakes or blunders, and today I wanted to show you such a game. I had only 2 inaccuracies in that game, and I think it's a really instructive chess game, because we'll talk about this so-called positional understanding of static pawn structures. And these static pawn structures, you should really be familiar with this kind of setups, because sometimes they seem to you that these setups are boring, but they'll have sort of their own rules, because here I already set you up a sort of a static pawn structure position. Here we have the pawns which are really blocked out. They cannot move at all, and there are many rules about this pawn structures, because you should know how to play in the continuation of this game. So the first thing that we have to say here is that pawn moves are of course not possible, so we have to create some pawn moves possibilities. How to do that? It's really important to occupy these squares, maybe with our knights, you see, because if something changes here, if maybe a knight takes out this knight, then we have again a potential mobile pawn, which is then again something that your opponent has to worry about, because this pawn could maybe promote to queen. So let's go back. What can also happen if maybe we have a trade of knight here on d5, then we have maybe here the so-called supported pass pawn situation, and again we could really annoy our opponent with some pawn moves here, with some endgame techniques, of course, and win the endgame. So you see, the first rule while having these static pawn structures is to put some pieces on the supported squares by these pawns. So it means we should really put some pawns here on the supported square by these pawns, and it could be also bishop, it can also be a rook. But it's really important to create a dynamic pawn structure from this static pawn structure. The other thing that we can say about these pawn structures is that we should be really familiar with this relation between pawns and bishops, because if we see now this pawn structure here, we have now white has of course the pawns on the light squares, black has the pawns on the dark squares. So it means if we have maybe here bishops on the board, the light square bishops and the dark square bishops, of course we would love to get rid of this light square bishops, because you see, in the continuation, black would be left here with this very weak bishop, which is only the defender of this dark square pawns. We would then have a really nice bishop, which could maybe here go around and attack here this g5 pawn. So you see, many things can be said about this static pawn structures, although they seem a little bit boring. But you'll see in this game that I've played on the simple rule about this static pawn structures and managed to win the game very effectively. So I played against a 23 50 100 rated player, and I really think it's an instructive game, because we had this common pawn structure, the static pawn structure. And I also want you to point you out that this is also a static pawn structure, although we have this e3 and the c6 pawn. But we always evaluate the static pawn structures about the possibility to move pawns. You see, here we can imagine such a position with our pawns. We can maybe here have many pawns on the board. Let's set up a potential pawn structure in the center. So see, we could have again a static pawn structure. And here, if black moves or if white moves the pawn, well, there is always this possibility to create this weak pawn, this isolated pawn situation. So you see, if black moves here the pawn on c5, then if we capture, and let's imagine the knight recaptures here, again black is really left with this weakness, with this long-term weakness, with this weak pawn on d5. The same thing as white. You see, if we start to push pawns here on e4, if we imagine this types of position, again white is left now with this isolated pawn situation. So you see, Although we have pawns on e3 and c6, this is still a static pawn structure because it's impossible to move pawns here. Here is also a static pawn structure, again with the same idea. If we try to move e5, again black will continue the game with this isolated pawn, the same as white. If we start to push pawns here, again white will continue the game with this long-term weakness on d4. So you see, as I said, in these types of positions you should really watch and try to occupy these squares that are supported by these pawns in this static pawn structure setup. So it means we should watch here for these squares in order to infiltrate in our opponent's position, in order to get some space. And if something now trades off this knight, let's imagine the position if the knight takes here on c5, then you see again we have a dynamic pawn structure, but now this is not a weak pawn because we have now the possibility to create a 3-on-2 pass pawn situation, and this could be really an important advantage in our own endgame. So you see, with this trade on c5 we created the dynamic pawn structure before we have this static one, and it's really important to occupy, as said, this supported squares, this in this case of course this c5 and maybe here even this e5. The same thing, if something trades off this knight here on e5, we can again trade off and then maybe create here a 5-on-4 situation on the king side and create maybe an attack on opponent's king while he has castle. So you see, with the support of course with some pieces here, bishop on d3, the common attacks would be maybe here queen on h3 with sort of an h7 attack with maybe possibilities to deflect the knight from f6 from the defense. So this is really a common play, creating this dynamic pawn structures from this static ones. And this is now a game that I wanted to show you because I managed to occupy my opponent's half of the board, he didn't, and that's why he lost the game. So let's see the game. I played here d4, we have c6, knight on f3. I didn't want to play immediately c4 because I wasn't sure if he's gonna transpose maybe into a perch defense or similar ideas. I just played this knight on f3 in order to delay the situation in the center, because in the next move he's gonna show me which opening is he playing. If he plays d6, then I can play this common opening line against this perch defense or this Philidor defense with knight on c3 and e4, which I like to play with this developing of the knights. Here after d5, now we have the Slav defense, and I played c4, knight on f6, knight on c3, this is still common theory, and now e6. And whenever I see, it's part of my style of playing, whenever I see this pawn structures, when my opponent tries to build fortresses with his pawns, I always like to undermine a little bit the position to weaken his pawn structure, and I simply took out c takes d5, and now he took c takes d5 also. And now we have this so-called static position. Again, I'm pointing you out, now we have this so-called static position in center, and now the main goal is to put some pieces here on the supported squares. Here maybe in this example it's the d5 and the f5. Here in this position, of course, this square would be the e5, and here also the c5. My opponent of course is searching here for this e4, and here also for the c4 square. So it's really a battle, it's a positional battle, and you should really understand this position, these static setups, because now the game is basically based around this 4 potential squares. So here bishop on f4. This is also a common move because you see the dark square bishop could be sort of a protector of this e5 square. So that's why I want to occupy this e5 immediately. My opponent played bishop on d6, and I simply took out. And that's the relation about these bishops and pawns. I don't mind to give up this bishop because I have a dark square bishop and I have a pawn on dark squares. Here, if the bishop takes on d6, queen takes on d6, my opponent is left here with this very weak c8 bishop. My bishop can still play after e3. My bishop on d3 will be much better because it will be on a very nice diagonal. This bishop would be really blocked out by its own pawns. So I don't mind to trade off this bishops here on d6. Here after e3 my opponent played bishop on d7, which is also a common move because there is this positional threat. If my opponent plays knight on c6, in order to prevent my potential knight on e5 idea, as I said, that the main goal is to occupy this e5 or the c5 square, I have here sort of a positional pin with bishop on b5. I want to get rid of this defender of e5 and then really infiltrate in the position with this knight outpost on e5, and then I can play the support with f4, maybe queen on f3, rook on f1 after castling. So many position, and again many healthy moves, and my opponent will again continue the game with this very weak bishop on c8. That's why you see my opponent tries bishop on d7 in order to prevent this bishop on b5 idea, and here I played bishop on d3. Castling was played, and now a6 again with the same idea. If again knight on c6, I'll try again maybe bishop on b5 and simply take out the knight and occupy the e5. Again a6. Now I played finally knight on e5. You see I have occupied this very important square on the other side of the board because we have the static pawn structure, and here if the position somehow changes in the center, I will create a dynamic pawn structure after d takes e5. Knight on c6, and now f4 because I want to stay with this very important positional advantage. If knight takes, of course, on e5, then black will lose the game because I'll create a fork on the knight and the queen. That's my b5. And here is now also sort of a rule in this static setups. Well, black will try this opposite side attacks, although we have castled on the same side that we have castled here on the king side. But because of this a6 b5 expand on the queen side, I really understood that my opponent will create his attack on the queen side, and I have to be fast. I have to create an attack on the king side. And now I wanted to show you these two inaccuracies that I've made. The computer suggests here in the immediately g4 move. Okay, it's of course a better move than I played the queen on f3, but it's also part of my style of playing because I want to finish first my development. I've now after queen on f3, I've developed all of my pieces. You see, I've played with my knight, with the bishop and the knight. I have connected the rooks. I have brought out the queen, and now I want to prepare queen on g4 and g5 ideas with queen on h3 in order to deflect the knight from f6 and creating checkmate threats on h7. So here my opponent played knight on b4, which I think is now his sort of first mistake, because here I played simply bishop on b1. And I really wanted to stay. I wanted really the knight here to stay on b4 because my opponent has placed this expanse on the queen side, and now it's impossible for him to play the move b4. This b4 may be followed with a5, a4 in order to somehow just to crack open the position here on the queen side. Here he stopped it with the knight on b4, and this knight can always be kicked away with a3, but I didn't want to arrest this knight from b4 because it really blocks out the attack by black, and this a3 would be really going again to knight on c6 and again challenging my knight on e5. Here this knight is perfectly fine. My opponent cannot play this outpost on e4 because this e4 square is very well protected by my queen, knight and bishop. So I created an outpost. My opponent cannot create one. This bishop is bad, this knight is perfectly fine, the bishop on b1 is perfectly fine, aiming on h7, and it will be my main attacker in the continuation of the game. Bishop on e8 was played. This is also a common move with this types of setup, because after g6 black will is trying to have a better defender here on g6, because his idea is here maybe knight on d7, challenging the knight, and then to play the move f6, kicking away my knight, and try maybe a pawn breakthrough here on e5 after a trade of knights. So that's why here now finally g4. As you can see, I will consider this g4 move, but I played first this healthy move, queen on f3. As I said, this is part of my playing style, because I want to first apply this basic principles in chess to develop the queen, removing the queen from the first rank, connecting the rooks. Here I finally played now g4 with the preparation to play g5, queen on h3, creating checkmate threats on h7, because the knight cannot jump, and again I'm pointing out to create an outpost on e4. Knight on d7 was played, and now queen on h3. Now I managed to weaken the king side at least a little bit, because now my opponent is forced to play the move g6. But he, with this g6, he also weakened his king side. It's not good sometimes to push pawns in front of your king, because there are many tactical possibilities. Black doesn't have anymore the dark square bishop, because now the dark square bishop would be really a good defender around the black's king. Here now he created many weaknesses on dark squares, so that's why here I pushed g5. I prevented here this potential f6 move, because I don't want to get kicked away by this pawn on f6. Here I prevented it with this g5 move, and now my opponent played f6. So here I took out. Here we have knight takes on f6, and again this knight from e5 cannot be kicked away by any pawns anymore, because black has pushed his d pawn, so he cannot play d6, and he pushed his f pawn, so he cannot push the pawn f6. So my knight will still be centralized on e5, and if something takes out the knight on e5, then again I'll recapture with the f pawn and have again a space advantage, because my pawn will be again on the 5th rank, which is really important to move slowly to create positional advantages in the game. So my opponent, I played king on h1, and my opponent played knight on d7 in order to kick away finally this knight from e5. This knight on e5 was really annoying. It created too much damage in the position, and I hope you realize that this knight is still stuck on b4. It didn't do anything, because it really paralyzed a little bit black's potential queenside attack with maybe a5, a4, b4, similar ideas. So you see, black basically blocked out its own position. Here, after king on h1, I was of course preparing the potential rook on g1, and here creating sort of a discovered attack on the king. This was my main idea, now to break through, because black has only now 2 pawns on the king side, and here I wanted to create sort of a demolition of the pawn structure in front of the king and try to checkmate my opponent. Still, black's pieces are paralyzed, because again this bishop is really blocked out, and you see how it was important in the beginning to trade off the dark square bishops, because black continued really the game with this weak light square bishop. So here rook on g1 finally, and now knight takes on e5. And here I discussed this position with one of my chess friends, David Halley from the USA. We are really now friends. We got friends through this very nice YouTube chess channel, and we hear each other every day. So here I asked him, with which pawn do you want to take this knight? And okay, David Halley is still a beginner. He said, I wanted to take here with this d pawn, and create maybe here pawn structure, mobile pawn structure, in order to deflect this pawns here in front of the king. But here you see, if you take with the d pawn, it really opens now the position for the bishop, because after bishop on c6, you see black has the possibility to push the pawn on d4, and that's not what we want to do. Here in the continuation, I took After knight takes on e5, f takes e5. Now the bishop is still blocked out. The bishop cannot play. We have a potential now sacrifice on g6. The black queen has to move. Here queen on e7 was played, and now knight on e2. This was also important to take with the f pawn, because now we have this f4 square for the knight, which is also an attacker on this g6 pawn. So here bishop on f7 was played, now knight on f4, and now our many pieces now in really nice attacking formation. This bishop, this knight is aiming on this g6, so 3 pieces. The queen is still on a very nice file because it prevents the king to escape. And here after rook on c8, now finally, of course, bishop takes on g6. A bishop sacrifice, we have bishop takes on g6, knight takes h takes g6, and now rook takes on g6. We have king on f7, queen on h5. I don't want my opponent to escape with the king, because if he tries king on e8, then I have a very nice discovered check. Rook takes on e6. The queen cannot, of course, come in between because of this pin, so black will lose the queen and eventually the game. So here after queen on h5, my opponent played rook on h8, and here I made this other inaccuracy in my game. I should have played here rook on h6, which would be a faster checkmate, but when I calculated this tactics, I saw this tactical sequence after rook on h8, rook on f6, and now king on g8, and now rook on g1, and it's game over. And I think this is very instructive game. As I said, I played only these 2 inaccuracies. Here I wanted to point you out, after this e3 move, we have this static pawn structure setup. We have now a better position because we traded off these bishops on d6, although the queen came out with a tempo. But here this bishop on c8, it was really a problem in long terms, and you see it didn't create any counterplay, and this is how you should really play in the static setups. You should be really familiar with these relations between pawns and bishops. When you see the static setup, you should ask yourself, okay, now we have a pawn here on the dark square, so of course it's good to maybe get rid of this dark square bishop, because the light square bishop would be much better than our opponents want. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this game. I will continue to do these games because I wanted to show you really my ideas sometimes in chess games, because I can explain it much better than maybe just explaining some grandmaster games or maybe some engine chess games, because I want to show you some of my ideas. I think they are applicable in your own games, and as I said, we will continue to do these games in the future. And as I also said, I'll just publish the ones in which I didn't have any mistakes or blunders in the game. Okay, meanwhile you can watch my other chess games, so my chess games from the series, and you can also watch the best chess games of all times. If you want to see the top grandmasters, they have played this immortal chess games with some queen sacrifices, rook sacrifices, and really nice attacking plays. And you can also watch computer chess games played like Leela, Stockfish, and many more. And you can also subscribe to my channel. Thanks you for watching, guys, and chess is the best, of course.